Hello, everyone. I'm Pamela Marshall at the Wellness Radio TV and at the Wellness Radio TV podcast. Today, the country comes together to honor the life and legacy of civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There are activities across the country and here in the Gainesville area, and I know there are things that are happening in your community as well. I thought I would take time today to just talk to some people that I know, starting with Dr. Rick Stevenson, about the Dr. King celebrations, what his legacy has meant, what it means for the future. Dr. Rick Stevenson, who is a professor of African American history and African American studies at the University of Florida. Dr. Stevenson is also my guest weekly for the Timbuktu Report. Dr. Stevenson, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. You caught me as I was running out the house.
I'm glad you turned around and ran the other way. Dr. Stevenson, we all hear about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and happy MLK Day to you first.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you. We hear about the dream, the I Have a Dream speech. But Dr. Martin Luther King also talked about something that I want to highlight today. He talked about the silence of those who who recognize things that are wrong and don't do anything or say anything. We have the dream, but what about the silence?
I think can we contextualize the dream speech first when he talks about being judged by the content of our character and not the color of our skin. He is pointing out that that is not the way the country functions.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have suggested that when he made that statement, he was saying that it was happening at the time and it was not. He was actually arguing that, and he uses this, that America has written a check that has come back insufficient funds. So it hasn't lived up to its calling, its responsibility. Now, having said that, as we look at today's circumstances and situations, I would argue that in one sense, the silence has been broken. And that silence being that white supremacists and white nationalists have made their voices very clear what they think America ought to be. On the other side, I think that there are those of us who are in position to challenge these notions of white nationalism, white supremacy, to challenge organizations like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys in saying, listen, 85% of America's wealth is held by 2 or 3% of the American population. And Black and brown people and immigrants are suffering at an all-time high. And so, yes, there is a sense in which some of the silence has been broken, but the silence that has been broken is on behalf of those who want to go back to the 1800s. So I'm hoping that as we continue in this conversation, the silence that you're hoping to be broken will be those who will stand up and stand fast against white nationalism and white supremacy.
Exactly. That, and I think that is what Dr. King talked about. The silence of those who recognize that things are wrong, yet they don't say anything about it. How do we, because I think probably sometimes there are more people who recognize that and are fearful. Imagine if we could get those people out of the shadows of the hatred that exists in this country.
I think it's not only comfortability, but it's apathy. It's not happening to them, so therefore they don't feel a need to engage in the conversation. And I think that what needs to happen is that Black people and brown people have to correlate and not allow those who are apathetic about our experience to just be apathetic. I think that if we look at a model like Malcolm X's model or Marcus Garvey's model, these are Black self-determining models, whereas we don't rely on other people to participate. I mean, think about it. We spend Black people, we spend up up and into billions of dollars a year on all kinds of things from liquor to cigarettes. What would happen if we were able to figure out a way to put that money into black banks, into black neighborhoods, into black real estate? Then their silence would make a difference, right? But because we constantly rely on those who are silent to support our issues, we find ourselves in the same position we're in today.
In the same position that we were in when you talk about in that position during the time of the civil rights movement of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was beaten because she registered to vote. Bless her heart, she was fired from her sharecropping job. It's almost like what a blessing. But that she was ran off of her sharecropping farm because she registered to vote. And as you talk about the same conditions, how are these conditions still very similar,
Mm.
Dr. Stevenson?
Well, I think the first thing we have to take into account is just the access or the lack thereof that 19 states have put in place to prevent people from having the right to vote. I think that we have to pay very close attention to the dynamic of how voting is directly connected to skin color. And people, white America has come to grips with the fact that because they have failed in the experiment of democracy, that a lot of people who come into this country will eventually, especially if they're persons of color or any other type of minority, will tend to vote Democratic, which means that the other party will not have the power that it normally had. And because white America is losing its numbers and black and brown America is growing, that means there's going to be a political party that has more voting power. And therefore, one of the ways to prevent people from accessing power and growing, as opposed to creating systems that would benefit all, they affect the ability to vote so they can control the power that comes from the political structure in this country.
As we're celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, his wife, Coretta Scott King, worked for 15 years before this day came about under the Reagan administration. And I saw an interview with Reverend Jesse Jackson, who said at the time that Dr. King was assassinated, he said, please don't say he gave his life. His life was taken.
It was thinking,
But at the time that he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, at the Lorraine Hotel, Reverend Jesse Jackson said Dr. King was one of the most hated men in America. What do you think he would observe from where we are today in actually observing a day in his honor of his birth?
yeah, I think in some cases he would be disappointed. He was not only hate. Some people think that he was hated by only white people. There were black people who didn't like him either.
Right.
Um,
People who said, you're going too fast, it's not time yet.
exactly. And I think that we have to take into account that there are people like Dr. King, like Frederick Douglass, who understood that black timing and white timing are not the same. And we have to push the envelope. And I think that today, if Dr. King were sitting on a throne, able to watch what we're doing, he would be somewhat disappointed. I think there are some parts of the American society, Black society, Brown society, that are moving forward. But for the most part, we've become rather comfortable. We're not as aggressive as I think we should be. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think that when it comes to education, we are not as educated as we should be. And you and I have spoken about this on several occasions, that our young people are so undereducated about how they are benefiting from the lives and the lives that were lost of people who come before them, that they're just, sliding through. And even though there is a sense in which there's a level of wokeness in America, for the most part, we are not pushing the envelope. We're not self-inventing. We're not self-promoting, and we're not self-supporting. And we have to understand that America was never designed to support people who didn't look like Europeans.
And when you say we're not pushing, Whose fault is it that we're not?
I don't think the blame can be placed on one place. I think a lot of us have a
By the
responsibility.
way, I'm enjoying this conversation.
Are you now?
Uh-huh. I hope those who are watching are finding it fruitful as well.
Yeah, I think I don't think that the blame can be placed in one place. I think the blame can be shared. I think that some of it can be shared in the pulpits, that our black churches are not doing what they used to do. I think some of the blame can be in our educational system. One of the things that I really appreciate about what's happened here in Gainesville, in Alachua County, that we have an African American studies curriculum that students will experience from kindergarten through K through 12, and so they'll get a chance to study and hear some of the narratives that tend not to make it to the traditional history books. But I think some of our politicians have dropped the ball. I think that some of our police officers have bought into this notion of the blue line. And so I don't think that there's one place that should be blamed. I think we all have to take a look in the mirror and say, what role am I playing in challenging our students? In my classes at the University of Florida, one of the things I ask my students in the first day of class, when they all have to do introductions, where they're from, their name, their so on. And the last question is, are you a revolutionary? And what's interesting is how many of those students have no idea what that word means,
Absolutely not.
right? And so by the end of the semester, if I ask when I ask the same question, for the most part, many of them would say, "Oh yeah, I am," and then they could explain why, because revolutionary and being a revolutionary simply means a participant in change. So how does that happen? Well, there are a number of different types of revolutions. There are some in the classroom, and there are those who are carrying signs, and there are those who are working in voting booths. And so there's a number of areas in which we can participate in revolutionizing the America that we live in. And I think that where we have dropped the ball is we have not allowed for or put in place those systems where we rely on ourselves to self-educate.
Well, and if you are in a system that is doing the opposite of the word, what the word education means, the base word of education is educing, helping people to tap into their gifts and their talents,
Right.
and to bring that forth as a contribution. Dr. King's effort for all men and women, regardless. And let me just say this: there's so many people who feel like the Dr. King holiday is just for Black people.
Yeah.
The he was there in Memphis, Tennessee, working on behalf of poor sanitation workers, but
Right.
his fight was for equality for all
Right.
Americans. And I think if that message was embraced, that would help change the narrative about you're better than I am because of the color of our skins. Dr. King's dream that all would be treated equal, based on the content of their character. So when you talk about this education and us being a part of a revolution, there may be people who think, well, I'm okay. I don't think that there's anything that I need to be involved with, as people did in 1964. I don't want to be part of the mess.
Sure. Sure. There is a level of apathy when one is not directly affected by the disenfranchisement.
But you
But
know what? I think there are times when there are people who are affected by the disenfranchisement and they have a level of fear.
and rightly so, I guess in America. I mean, but 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 what are you fearful of? Right? Are you fearful of success? Are you fearful of failure? Are you fearful of dying? Because the truth of the matter is, all of us experience all of those dynamics.
Mhm.
All of us have some level of success, some of us have some level of failure, and all of us, sooner or later, if Jesus doesn't come back, will die. So, what do you have to lose? I think I think the other part, though, when we talk about the Poor People's March, we have to take into account that in today's society, we are not as people oriented as we used to be. we don't say please and thank you. We're not as accommodating to people, even people of color, to ourselves. I mean, when I was coming up, if you were walking down the street and you walked towards someone, even if you didn't know them, you would speak. People don't do that anymore. And it's because we have become so siloed in the way we see the world that everything is about me and mine. We're really not concerned about Pamela Marshall. I don't care if you get a flat tire on the street. I'm not concerned about whether you can pay your mortgage because it's not affecting me. And so the whole concept of what it means to be in community has also broken down significantly.
We're talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as we are celebrating his birthday today. Today he would be 92,
Yes,
93,
yes.
92,
92.
92 years old. His life was taken when he was 39 years old in Memphis, Tennessee, when he was there gathering and working toward helping the sanitation workers. This, when you talk about whether or not we are compassionate about what's happening to other people. Dr. King certainly did not have to be doing what he was doing.
Right. In a
He was
PhD.
an educated man. He was a Morehouse man. He pastored a church in Atlanta, Georgia. His father pastored that church, Ebenezer Baptist Church. He was, for all intents and purposes, a young man chosen, and family could have lived a very comfortable life without doing what he did. Taking to the streets, putting his life on the line, putting his wife and his children's lives on the line. He didn't have to do that. So
Right.
for those who are in comfortable places today, and I think where we are in this pandemic with COVID, this virus has equalized um, what can happen to all of us to a certain degree. There are those who have comorbidities. There are those who don't have access. There are those who are not able to get the proper treatment.
Sure.
How is today uh, similar to what we're talking about with the civil rights movement? While you may be okay, and if someone else is not okay, why should you be involved? Or how do we encourage people to be involved?
Well, I think that we have to again look at the other aspect of Dr. King's life, and that was his theological and biblical perspective of community. And I believe that Dr. King really believed the narrative of Jesus, that the true believer is a person of love, and love by definition, true love is sacrificial. And so that I think that's the missing part. He talks about the beloved community, and what does that look like, right? What does it look like to love that person who does not look like you? I was engaged in a conversation Wednesday on the role of the Black church in the social active social justice movement of today. And I argue that Luke chapter 10, which we call the narrative of the Good Samaritan, which is oxymoronic because in the mind of a Jewish person, there was no such thing as a Good Samaritan, is a perfect narrative of what love looks like. And that is the Samaritan was hated by Jews. In the narrative that Jesus talks about, the man who is laying on the ground, having been beat up, is a Jew. And three other Jews walked past him, a priest, a scribe, and another person, Pharaoh. Uh, uh, but then this Samaritan who bends and knows that even if I help this guy, he might hate me. And yet Jesus says he's a good Samaritan because he didn't allow his personal views about the culture or the nature of the persons he's helping prevent him from doing the right thing. And so I think that we have to take into account that one of the things that fueled Dr. King was his love for Jesus and his love for the Word of God. And that if we really understand what it means to walk as a believer, the badge, the trademark of the Christian is love, and it's unconditional.
We have a comment from Charlene Obel, who is in South Carolina, a veteran um, for this country, and she poses an interesting question. Why is it a happy day? We're no further along now than we were then. And that's a sentiment that many people feel when they look at some things that continue to happen. The killing of African Americans, not just by guns, but because of lack of nutritional food, the
Sure,
incarceration,
sure.
the high rate of incarceration of African Americans, the fact that African Americans were strong enough to build this country, and in 150 years, just in a short 150 years, the African American has evolved into being the sickest group of people in the United States of America. And that's not the DNA that built this country. So those kinds of things
Mhm.
that still cause, the all of the list of diseases that you can come up with, African Americans are generally at the top of that list. So
Yes.
her comment, why are we happy? We're no further along than we were then. Are we under a false sense of we shall overcome? We have overcome?
Yes, that's a good question. I know I really don't think we have overcome. I would agree with her 100% in that part. But I think there is a sense in which happiness is relative. My father only had a fifth grade education. My mother just barely made it in high school. But there's three of us in my family who all have degrees, and two of us are doctors. So there is a sense in which happiness has invaded some of us, and I use that invade intentionally. But when we speak about the group of Black people, when we speak of the communities, we have to take into account that though we are the sickest and though we are the poorest, it is oftentimes because of the systems under which we live. Where are most of the factories that pollute the air in Black communities? Where are most of your food deserts? Black communities. And how does that happen? It's because these white conglomerations, these large corporations determine not only where they will build their factories, but then when we redline and control the population where people can buy houses, we dictate where they can live as well. So some of that we don't have control over, and we should. Uh,
Yeah, and I think that's the point.
yeah,
If you are dying by hanging from a tree, or dying because the trees around you are dying because the environment and the air quality is so poor, or there are no longer any trees, and you're dying as a result of that, we're still dying and at disproportionate numbers, whether it is malnutrition or health. I think or do you think we focus so much on gun violence that we forget about the violence that happens to the cells of our bodies because of what we're breathing and eating?
that's a good point. I think the media doesn't talk about food deserts as they talk about gun violence. So
Right, right.
the media doesn't talk
There's
about
no blood.
exactly,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And we all know that sex, murder, that kind of stuff, drugs sells, right? You think about, Cancer Alley in New Orleans, where you have all these factories polluting air. No one talks about that. I was talking to my students just recently about the Flint water crisis.
Mhm.
Where else in the country can a governor change the water infiltration system by using water that they know is contaminated and get away with? Would that happen in Boca Raton?
No.
Probably not. And so I think that the media also plays a role in advancing the information that helps us better understand the plight of people of African descent and minorities.
Dr. Rick Stevenson, a professor of African American history and African American studies at the University of Florida. We're talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day and the dream, but more importantly, the silence that is deafening right now across our country. Um, Jesse Moore from Jackson, Tennessee said, "Thank you for sharing this information. I'm concerned about the state of our world."
Mm.
Do you think this concern, as people were concerned during the time in many parts of the South when the lynchings were taking place, that the silence is with us as well? We're concerned, but then we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that history history shows us that especially in Black and brown communities, white America has figured out how to stop us, and that is just cut off the head. We have become accustomed to a single person as the leader as opposed to a organization that leads. And so whenever we have really had a good push with the Martins, with the Malcolms, they assassinate them. Even John F. Kennedy, who was really interested in trying to make some changes. I think, I mean, obviously he had his flaws, but he was assassinated. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, when do we get to a place when we have organizations like BLM, Black Lives Matter, and other change organizations? These organizations that are cross-cultural, they are cross-gender, and they understand the politics of America. And as they are pushing forward, they are making inroads, but they don't get the same kind of media attention as a lynching or a shooting would. So, have we come forward? I would say yes. Have we come as far as we should be? I would say no. Are we still on the road of movement? I think slower now than before. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is just the competition from media, from social media to Facebook to TikTok. I mean, walk down the street and look at people. I've been in restaurants where it's 4 people at the table about to order their meal, and they're all on their phones.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So there was competition for our attention that didn't happen in the 60s and the 70s and the 50s and 40s and 30s.
Doctor, this you have children, a grandchild. I have a son, a 3-year-old grandson, and I was thinking the other day, what am I leaving for them? As an African American woman, what am I leaving for Brennan? What am I leaving for BJ?
Hmm.
How have I really worked hard enough to at least look like I was trying to
Yeah.
make a difference?
Yeah.
Is that a question that every African American should be asking themselves and having this conversation at every gathering, at every table?
Absolutely. My youngest son, well, I talk to both of my sons pretty frequently, but my youngest son and we talk almost every other day. And this morning was funny. I was talking to him a couple of weeks ago, and he said, "Dad, I want to co-sign for a person, and they want to do this thing, and I want to help them out." And I said, "Man, that's not necessarily a good idea, because you can co-sign for someone, and they mess up, and then you're screwed." So this morning, during my own devotional time, I was reading Proverbs, and Proverbs chapter 17 says that it's a poor judgment to guarantee another person's debt or put security up for a friend. Verse 18. So I sent that to him. And, I said to him, this is just another lesson I'm trying to teach you about being a Black man in America, and I've been doing that for him forever. Right. So, yes, I think we have to have those kind of conversations.
But even with you and your boys, and I have friends who have children who are doing well. How much are we instilling in them? Now you go teach.
Yeah, well,
You go get.
that's always been my thing. My
Yeah,
sons have always been challenged to tell someone else what I've told them.
yeah.
But that's just me. That's just the way I raised my sons. I've always taught them that anything I've learned is not just for me, it's for someone else. And therefore, as I am teaching it to you, it is so that you can share with someone else. So I think they have a pretty good track record of doing some of that, but that's just me. I don't know about other people, and I can't speak for them.
Right, right. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Stood in the gaps many times for a lot of people, and carried that weight with him. I remember touring the museum National Civil Rights Museum
Mhm.
in Memphis. And as we got closer to his room and Mahalia Jackson started singing
Mhm.
and thinking, God, can we just change this course?
Yeah.
Can it be different? As we approach the room where Dr. King spent his final moments of this journey, do you think that as we get caught up in Stevie Wonder's song "Happy Birthday to You" and we're just bouncing and singing,
Sure.
do you think that we've lost the moment of what that feels like? As a matter of fact, do you remember when you found out
Found out what?
about the assassination of Dr. King?
Vaguely.
Okay.
But I do remember the push for his birthday. I think that it is important to have milestones of historical remembrances. In the book of Joshua, when the Israelites were about to cross the river into the promised land, Joshua told them to get 12 stones and write on these stones, and these stones would be a memorial and a reminder of where God has brought us from. And so I think that in a sense, the the celebration of Dr. King's birth is a reminder of where God has brought us from. Now, does that mean God is done? No. But I think we have to have milestones of success. If you remember, it took 7 or 8 years before this thing became a holiday.
15.
Yeah, 15
Mhm.
years. And so, that was blood, sweat, and tears that we had to go through. And remember, we're dealing with a predominantly white, predominantly white racist, white supremacist government that had to even consider this becoming a holiday. So I think there are certain milestones that remind us that the struggle is still on. If nothing else, Dr. King's birthday reminds us that we're still in the fight. It's not over.
And as Fannie Lou Hamer said, if you were born with a black face in America, you are in this mess.
Amen.
You are in this struggle. And where does it end? Um, we don't know. And I think that's part of the uncomfortableness. I think it was James Baldwin who said to be black in America is to be in a constant state of rage,
Hmm.
to certainly be in a constant state of alert, that
Hmm.
at any time, anything can happen. And
Amen.
I think that if you're not African American, you don't have a real appreciation for that. You don't have an appreciation for you could get a phone call about any African American male in your family that something has happened and maybe nothing will be done about it. As we are observing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, I think the equality that he stood for, that he, part of his dream was that everybody, everybody would live out that true meaning
Hmm.
that all men and women are created equal.
Hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson.
My
I
pleasure.
appreciate you taking time to chat with us. And I thank you also for watching. We're going to have some interviews throughout the day, so pop back in. We look forward to seeing you. I'm Pamela Marshall at the Wellness Radio TV and at the Wellness Radio TV podcast. Remember, there is healing at the well.
The well.
Make it a great moment. We'll see you.